Great. Thank you, Megan, and big thanks to you and to TTRA broadly for the opportunity to kind of share what we're thinking about today. So, as Megan said, I'm Chris Davidson. I oversee MMGY's travel intelligence team. I'm based here in Kansas City. And for those of you not familiar with MMGY, we are the largest global integrated marketing agency specializing in travel and tourism. And so everything we do from a research and data and analytics perspective is truly designed to be kind of foundational for what we do from a planning perspective, both for our teams internally as well as for our network of client partners around the world. So, um, consistent with that mission, today's webinar is not just a kind of here's a bunch of data points and good luck with that. Our hope is that we'll reveal some of what we're seeing in the latest data, in the latest research. And then I've invited three executives from our organization, as Megan pointed out, to help translate those into implications, ideas, recommendations, and ultimately strategies that may be helpful for all of you joining. So saw a number of friends out there today joining across the country, especially, even to a certain extent across the world. And just want to thank you all for taking the time and making this an important part of your day. So first, we're going to have Simon Moriarty is going to give us about a 10-minute overview of some of the highlights that we're seeing in the yet-to-be-published spring edition of the Portrait of American Travelers. And then we'll use that as a jumping-off point to explore what it all means. And so thereafter, we have Trey Williams, who heads up strategic planning for MMGY, as well as Andrea Olson, media director. And they will help us really tell us what it means in their minds and what they're seeing and how it's impacting planning decisions that we're making each and every day. So, Simon, take it away. Eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. I will just start sharing my screen and hopefully this all works. So you should be able to see Portrait of American Traveler slides. Yeah, cool, good. I was looking intently at the other panelists and they gave me the nod of approval, so that's a good start. So yeah, thank you for your time this morning, this afternoon, wherever you're listening. As Chris said, my role really is to provide a snapshot of the key findings of the upcoming spring edition of Portrait of American Traveler for 2026. And just to give you a flavor of what we're seeing across the American travel landscape, focusing on the key areas of interest and importance, and then using that to discuss what we think will change in the future, how we think the changes that we're seeing up until now will have an impact longer term as well, and really focusing on the key things that are driving American travelers, from everything from booking to decision making to starting to think about long-term planning. And what's shifted with Portrait of American Traveler, we have the benefit of being able to compare quarter on quarter and year on year, going back a number of years. So we're really able to pick out the trends that are shaping the travel landscape in America, but broadly and more globally as well. So to give you a very top line overview of the current state of the US traveler based on our most up-to-date research, as Chris said, this is not yet published. This report will be publishing within the next 2 weeks. But what we're seeing from the data is that broadly, there's a lot of positives. American travelers are planning to spend more on vacations. They're also planning to take more trips in the next 12 months compared to the end of last year, so the previous quarter, winter 2025. One of the key things that's driving that, we're in a big year for sports with the FIFA World Cup coming up in the summer across the US, Mexico, and Canada. Sporting events in general are playing a big part, and also event travel in general is becoming much more of a big driver of travel decisions, leisure travel decisions in particular. Over a quarter of the responders that we surveyed who are interested in sporting events have expressed an interest in attending the FIFA Men's World Cup this year. We're doing a lot of research around that event in the run-up to the actual tournament, but also looking at the knock-on effects afterwards as well, and what brands, organizations, destinations should be thinking about in advance, but also what they can learn after the event as well. We're also seeing across the travel spectrum, brand loyalty has grown year on year across the airline, hotel, cruise line, and car rental spaces. We're seeing an increase across all of those areas where people are focusing on loyalty that is driven by discounts, so discounted prices, cost effectiveness, but also the ability to be able to collect and collate all of their loyalty points and then spend them when they feel like they want to. So having that flexibility from a cost point of view, but also being able to spend the loyalty points that you've accrued over months or years or even decades of being associated with a particular loyalty program. We're also seeing some interesting generational comparisons across a lot of the spaces that we investigate as part of this study. We've seen that resorts, bed and breakfast, short-term vacation rentals, these are all gaining ground over traditional chain-affiliated hotels, particularly among younger travelers. But we are seeing a nice curve in the data where younger travelers are focusing on those alternatives, and then the older travelers, older consumers are much more loyal to traditional hotels. So we're seeing some interesting comparisons in the accommodation space between different generations and different demographics. Sustainability, I think, is something we will talk about a lot during this session. It's something that we've talked about a lot over the last few years. It's obviously a hugely important issue in the world of travel. And what we're seeing is that people's attitudes and perceptions of sustainability are changing. A quarter of younger consumers, Gen Z and millennial travelers, say that the impact of sustainable and environmental considerations by the travel service providers that they are choosing has a great impact on their decisions when it comes to choosing destinations and choosing holidays. But compare that to older travelers, only 3% of boomers say the same thing. So again, there's an interesting generational shift, and we're seeing that and how that will have an impact on how brands, how destinations, how anyone associated with the travel industry should be approaching issues around sustainability and environmentalism. And then planning and dreaming. So the whole process that we look into at MMGY from when you start thinking about where you would like to go on vacation, on holiday, and then the steps that you take to actually make that dream into a reality. Half of the US leisure travelers that we surveyed have used ChatGPT or other AI tools for travel planning. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, it's again younger consumers, 76% of Gen Z, 68% of millennials, who are utilizing those tools more than any other generation. So just to dive into those numbers a little bit, I know Chris said this isn't just some data points and best of luck, but there are some data points. But we will then be talking through what these mean for the travel industry, for marketers, for strategists. As I mentioned, there are lots of positives. Travel intent, expected spending has increased from the end of last year. Travelers are expected to go big in 2026. I think in times of uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, things that are happening around the world that impact people's feelings of safety, security, just general sense of certainty, of surety, things that impact their financial situation. People still want to experience the things that bring them joy, and travel obviously plays a huge part of that. So we're seeing that the expected overnight leisure travel spend over the next 12 months from spring of this year has risen from just under $5,500 at the end of last year to just over $5,700. And the expected number of overnight leisure trips in that same period in the next 12 months has risen from 3.75 at the end of last year to 3.87. So as I said, people intend to take more trips and they intend to spend more while they are taking them. Which feeds into the importance of loyalty, because people want to spend money on the things that they care about, the brands that they're loyal to. You can see here across the hotel, airline, cruise line, car rental spaces, there have been some fairly important rises in loyalty. The percentage of travelers who consider themselves to be loyal to a hotel brand has risen by 2 percentage points, quarter on quarter. Airlines slightly more, 3 percentage points. Cruise lines, a similar story, has risen to just over 30%, and then car rental has gone up to a third of people who are loyal to a car rental brand or consider themselves to be loyal to a car rental brand. Loyalty is something that brands, anyone working in the travel space, works hard to achieve. Once it is achieved, it can lead to a hugely important relationship between you and your customers. But loyalty is also something that can be very easy to lose if brands or organizations aren't behaving or acting or providing the service that consumers expect. So people consider themselves to be loyal, but that loyalty can shift quite quickly with important knock-on effects. And you can see here, just focusing on some of the accommodation points that I mentioned, the short-term rental traveler versus the traditional hotel traveler. Short-term rental makes up a slightly smaller number, 38% of active leisure travelers, but it is heavily skewed towards the Gen Z and millennial generations. You can see the other side of that coin, 55% of active leisure travelers consider themselves to be traditional hotel travelers. And again, there's a skew towards the older end of the spectrum, 61% of Gen X and 75% of boomers. And it's also interesting to see the expected leisure trips that those groups are intending to take. The flexibility that's perhaps associated with short-term rental is reflected by the fact that slightly more of those travelers are taking more leisure trips or plan to take more leisure trips over the next 12 months, 4.2. So not a huge difference to the 4 holidays or the 4 leisure trips that traditional hotel travelers are planning. But you can see that there are some differences. But importantly, the motivators for both of those groups, the things that really drive them to take those trips are the same. It's spending time with their spouse and their children. 80% of short-term rental travelers and 77% of hotel travelers to get away and unplug, about the same, 78 and 76%, and then exploring nature and the outdoors, 67% and 61%. So whether you're working in the short-term rental space or the traditional hotel accommodation space, it's important to recognize that people want the same things from their accommodation, from their vacation. They want to unplug. They want to share those things with those closest to them. And they want to explore the surroundings in which they are staying. And there's huge opportunities for brands to respond to that. And then thinking about that important issue of sustainability, we can see that the importance of sustainability, environmental considerations has returned to levels that we saw a couple of years ago now. 15% of active leisure travelers say that a travel service provider's focus on sustainability and environmental considerations greatly impacts their travel decision making. So it's something that motivates a significant number of people to make a choice when it comes to destinations or booking a holiday. We saw a slight dip last year to 11%, but it's risen back up to 15%. And we're seeing again that younger consumers, Gen Z, millennials, and that those travelers with children are the ones who are most likely to have their travel choices influenced by the sustainability of the service providers they book accommodation, they book flights, or they book their experiences with. But it's moving away from perhaps in the, 5-10 years ago, people would have thought specifically about one element of their trip, maybe about the distance they were flying, the carbon offsetting of a car rental, what their hotel brand was known for in the environmental space. But what we're seeing now is it's split and shared across every element of the holiday and the travel service that is provided to them. And then the last thing that I will share with you today before handing back over to Chris is the motivators from the different stages of the travel booking process. So what we think about when we're dreaming about vacation, what motivates us to start that process. And a significant number, 44%, are driven initially by reading an interesting article. So they're driven by reportage from traditional and online media sources. People want change, they want adventure. They're influenced by the posts of others, whether they know those people or not. Seeing interesting social media posts influences 36% of people to start dreaming about a vacation. So starting that kind of fantasy idea of where you would like to go before starting to plan what's within reach. Being influenced by FOMO, I guess, seeing other people's photos from vacation and starting to think, it's time I took a holiday, it's time I went somewhere sunny or somewhere where I can explore nature or go and watch a football match, whatever it was, soccer match, I should say. And by consuming media and becoming influenced by everything that talks about that destination will start people dreaming. And then when it comes to planning, some things are intangible, some things are tangible, some things are kind of set in stone in terms of how much time off work you can get, things like school holidays. So traditionally starting to plan for specific times of year still drives the majority of people. They're also influenced by cost. Good travel deals still motivates a large proportion of people at 54%. Again, that influenced by other people, partners, spouses, celebrating those big events that people want to share with others, and using up their vacation time. So lots of kind of factors that all intersect and are interchangeable in many ways. It's the influence from others, what posts people are seeing, how can brands tap into that, what should they be sharing, how should they be influencing people to start them on that process and on that journey. And with that, I will hand back over to Chris.
Great. Thanks, Simon. And a lot of great information there. It's obviously covers a wide gamut, and there's a lot more to come when that's released in a couple of weeks, as you said. So One of the things that I find pretty interesting about the data that's surprising, at least to me, is that, the optimism that exists in the eyes of American travelers right now. When you look at travel intentions, you look at travel spending, it's up, and it's up, unmistakably. If you look across, the group. But one thing we didn't see is we didn't see that breakout, which we will have, if you look at the full report, you see the breakout of how that intent and spending intentions change across generations, but also across income strata. So, various levels of affluence, and something that, Trey, we've been watching this, pretty closely, since 2021, especially. We've seen a real bifurcation in travel intent and spending based upon household income strata. Right, the households who make 100,000 plus especially are, remain steady in their travel intentions, pretty consistently. And in fact, throughout, the post-COVID recovery, it's been pretty consistent, really at a very high level in terms of travel intent and increased spending over time. Whereas those who are making less than $100,000 as a group are significantly much less likely to have that same level of optimism about the year ahead.
Mm.
So how do you how do you think about that? Is travel becoming unaffordable, for a growing segment of the population? How can travelers avoid the temptations of prioritizing more affluent traveler as an increasingly singular mission, or should they? I mean, what are you thinking about right now?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that question, Chris. I think that's something that we've been talking about a lot. My hot take for the last year is that K-shaped economy should have been the word of the year, but dictionary.com went with 6-7 instead, which I'm sure all of us with kids would begrudgingly agree. There you go, Chris. I think the K-shaped economy is affecting the way that we have to think about every industry, not just travel. That said, I think travel brands can think of those data points as sort of a mixed bag. Despite what we're seeing, I think one of the most important notes that I took from the report was the fact that 79% of Americans are still planning to travel in the next 12 months. That's as high, if not higher, than we've seen at the beginning of the year for the past couple of years. So travel is still something that all consumers across generations, across income streams are definitely prioritizing. I don't want to give too much of the report away so that Chris doesn't come find me after this webinar. But one of the interesting points that I saw was that the greatest one of the greatest increases in travel intent actually came from those consumers in the 30K to 50K income bracket. So, even though those consumers are struggling, they're having to cut back on some discretionary spending in other areas. They're still very much prioritizing travel. You know, um, Obviously, these numbers are going to need to be adjusted based on current events, but at the beginning of the year, I saw an estimate that said the travel and tourism industry could expect an increase in estimated growth of 8.5%. We're coming off of a year of only 2.5%. So, the optimism for travel in 2026 is extremely high. Granted, the current event cycles and news headlines are definitely going to sway people one way or the other, but I think people are still they still think that travel is something that's very important, and that's regardless of household income. When we look at February, Bank of America just released some data that said that some of the largest growth in household expenditures came from lower income households compared to higher income households. And a lot of that is being driven by tax refunds, and the prioritization for those tax refunds is coming from lodging, airfare, restaurants, the kind of things that really drive the tourism industry forward. So even though those consumers are struggling, again, they're very much prioritizing travel, and they're going to continue to prioritize it through the rest of this year, because travel is just something that's very important to them. I think we're also seeing shifts in what travel means to people. A lot of people are saying that they are traveling to enrich their passions or indulge in a hobby. Some of the rationales for why people are traveling are definitely evolving, which makes tourism more important to them. Another interesting data point was the idea that fewer people are saying that they're going to spend more on travel because travel just costs more. They're saying that they just want to spend more on travel, and that's a huge boon for the industry. I think people are going to be spending more because they want to spend more, but we do have to be careful because they're going to be traveling smarter. I think if we look at last spring's portrait of the American traveler, we saw an average number of trips for the next 12 months that was higher than what we're seeing now. So, people are scaling maybe back a little bit on the number, but they're willing to spend more because it's something that they want to do and they want to have really good trips.
Yeah, it's all really good points, and um, it really truly is incredible if you look at that level of optimism and how consistent it remains, even in the midst of uh, geopolitical tensions, even in the midst of financial hurdles and barriers, and just a lot of increasing complexity in life. So great points, and thank you for highlighting that. Let's turn for a minute to in terms of how people travel or how people plan for travel rather, and obviously the technology that's available at people's fingertips to do that now has never been more sophisticated, right? With generative AI and the agentic AI, and what you're able to do not only for planning but for booking and for end to end, being able to plan your vacations. For the first couple of years, we saw ChatGPT had first come out a few years back, and there was about 30% of the leisure travel population that was telling us they used generative AI, one of the available tools to do their travel planning or some aspect of their travel planning, from dreaming and inspiration to actually booking a trip. And that it surprisingly stayed pretty consistent around 30, I think it was 32% for a few years in a row when we thought it was going to be increasing. But the last couple of years now, we've started to see that really rise, and it's now up over 50%. So, Andrea, as you look at that, and then how is that insight kind of impacting your approach from a media planning perspective? And then I've got a follow-up question for Trey as well. But Andrea, how is that affecting how you're thinking about that from a media planning perspective?
Yeah. Um, One of the data points that is included in the full study is about how travelers are starting to use this more. And one of the top areas has been to suggest activities of interest or helping plan itineraries. So a lot of the time when we're seeing people use AI, it's falling more in that like intent funnel phase where they're really looking at, okay, I've decided to come on to this destination, and helping them put together like the itinerary and things they want to do there. So we see a lot of opportunity for educating people more in that space about, what are opportunities and things for them to do in the destination. What's sort of that unique selling opportunity for what you have to offer versus other destinations, and how can people help build an itinerary of what they want to do there. From a media perspective, that puts a lot of emphasis on people who have already decided to come. So one thing we're really taking a look at in terms of media plans for clients is making sure that we're not ignoring that inspiration phase as well. So, AI is really useful for helping put together your actual itinerary and things you want to do for your trip and helping you with accommodations. But it is still important for people to hear about the destination first in order to put those prompts together. So, from a media perspective, we're just trying to make sure that we include both that awareness to help people, get inspired and want to visit, and then driving them further in the funnel in order to put together what they want to do when they get there.
Good stuff. So as we think about this at a macro strategy level, then obviously there's implications of this new technology as well. Trey, how are you thinking about that? And when clients come to you and say, "Man, this is a crazy new world. What do we do?"
Yeah, I mean, I think are one of the things that I am consulting and cautioning with a lot of clients on is thinking about what people love about your brand. Some people love a destination because it is innovative and, there are incredible things to do there. But some people, especially like a lot of outdoor consumers, want to go there because it is a destination that hasn't changed too much. So I think we have to think about it from a consumer lens for sure, what consumers want, to things to be made easier in the same way that they've always received it versus who wants new technology. Not every traveler is super tech savvy. Not everybody wants a ton of new tools. So destinations have to really think about who their consumer is and understand, their level of tech savviness, their level of openness to innovation before we just jump in and say that the new shiny object is definitely the way to go. That said, I think there are consumers who are resistant to things just because they haven't used them yet. So sort of easing them into new technologies is a way to kind of convince them that they want something that they may not necessarily say that they want.
Yeah, it's a great point. We have, we looked at this for a while, as you know, and some of the things that I find fascinating are you've got a client or a consumer who's saying, "I love the technology and all that's possible, but I'm not sure I fully trust it yet." Right? I mean, so you've got this, hesitation to, especially, when there's, potential for hallucinations and, just, things are, open on different days, and and the AI wasn't smart enough to recognize that. It's getting better and better and better, so probably will be, less frequently be the case. But, they still want a human in the loop. So they want the power of the technology, but they also want to understand that somebody's there, guiding them through the process, and that might be at the local level, the hotel or resort or restaurant or whatever it might be. But I think we're still a little ways away from having it be an end-to-end, fully agentic solution. So we'll see. Um, Simon, as we're thinking about, you talked a lot about the sustainability and some of what we continue to measure the importance of environmental and sustainability considerations on travel, and that's something I think we've been doing now going back to around 2012 or 13 or 14, right in there. And it's amazing to see how that grew for a long period of time, and still maybe it's tempered a bit, but it really is still incredibly important, and especially to a younger traveler. It is seen to be very, very important in the decision-making process. Now, we look at them, we say, "Well, okay, well, we know it's important, but in a time of, again, geopolitical tensions and financial pressures and all sorts of things, do those things ultimately take the day and environmental considerations maybe take more of a back seat? Or are you still, do you still, from the data, interpret that to mean that this is still a very important and relevant topic that, travel industry marketers need to take very, very seriously and do very, very well?"
Yeah, I think it's both, to be honest. It's a concept. The concept of sustainability is still hugely important. It still is always up there or thereabouts when you talk to people about motivations for visiting one destination over another, or why they would choose one way of doing things, one behavior change in their life. Outside of travel, inside of travel, sustainability and environmental concerns will always be up there, always behind things like cost and issues of personal safety, and kind of anything that has a negative impact on your day-to-day life. Because I think for so many people, sustainability and environmentalism is still such a big, broad topic that it's hard to see what the tangible impact is, unless you've been directly impacted by something like wildfires in a destination, which we've seen obviously the last couple of years has had a tangible impact on holiday destination choices and disruption and so on. But for the vast majority of people, unless it's had that tangible impact, it kind of becomes this quite nebulous concept. You're always going to say, yes, it's important. And primarily that's human behavior. You don't ever want to say to someone, I don't care about the environment, or I want my behavior to actively harm the environment. People will always go the other way and say, actually, I do care about these things. What we're seeing is the onus continues to be on the brands and organizations. That's why people are willing to spend more if a brand is showing what they're doing from an environmental point of view, and that they're, actively putting back into their local economies, or they're rebuilding or reforesting or carbon offsetting. But I think importantly, just piggybacking on the AI conversation, what's an interesting kind of dichotomy that we're seeing is that it's the younger people that are starting to use AI tools more and more within the holiday booking and travel planning processes. But AI has a hugely negative impact on the environment. with things like the impact on water usage and water shortages and energy consumption. So I think we will get to a tipping point where people have to start thinking about their behavior in more than just that kind of broad strokes kind of approach that I care about the environment, but I also care about getting the best deal. So I'm going to use AI to help me track that, and that will make my holiday. You can imagine a point where someone is using AI to ask questions about what the most environmentally friendly type of vacation is, but because they're using the AI to ask those questions, they are damaging the environment. So it's kind of becomes this circular thing where I think consumers, travelers are looking for organizations, whether that's holiday, travel service providers, accommodation providers, or local governments, destinations, to actually step in and say, this is what we're doing, or this is what is happening, this is the impact. So the transparency around sustainability continues to be the most important thing. And then it's down to people to make those choices themselves. But we are becoming more and more kind of entrenched in a situation where whatever we do is going to have a negative impact on the environment. And it's about balancing the shortcuts of using AI versus the not using AI and having a very small positive impact on the environment.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that, especially you talked about it being a fairly nebulous thing sometimes. It's not always easy to understand what your what your impact is on the environment when you travel. And it's not like you're presented with a series of choices. I want to damage the environment. I want to somewhat damage the environment. I want to marginally damage the environment. So there are, the choices aren't necessarily clear. And therefore, I think it's really incumbent upon us as travel industry marketers to figure out ways to better educate consumers and meeting planners and so forth, but other stakeholders in the travel ecosystem, and say how can we create a more sustainable travel environment overall, and how do we then translate that to messaging to our to travelers so that they can make those choices over time. So it's all great points. Um, Trey, we were talking a little bit earlier, and so I'm curious, how do you see, travel brands needing to shift their tone a little bit to create a sustainability story that meets travelers where they are now?
Yeah, yeah. I think Simon hit the nail on the head earlier when he said that sustainability, quote unquote, is a very broad topic, and I think it is really hard for consumers to wrap their minds around every bit of what goes into sustainable travel. So the short answer is that consumers have, or excuse me, brands need to make sustainability a core assumed part of their brand. I think there is a little bit of a shift happening right now. If we looked at just a couple of years ago, over tourism was sort of the sustainability issue of the day. That was what travelers were really concerned about. Our latest research just shows that fewer and fewer people are being deterred by overcrowding in a destination, but at the same time, an increasing percentage of them are willing to pay more for sustainable services. I think that is an indication that consumers are shifting the onus for sustainable travel from themselves and making individual changes themselves over to brands. And they're saying, okay, brands, you need to make sustainability part of a core pillar of your brand. If I engage with you, I have to assume that you are going to be engaging your services in the most sustainable, environmentally friendly way. So in terms of the story, I think that, we still need to make those claims, even though fewer and fewer consumers say that they believe sustainability claims from brands. But we need to give them the information and just put it right out there without any sort of greenwashing or, sort of putting a feather in our own caps. I think sustainability just needs to be part of our story without trying to make it be anything special, because consumers will definitely call us out on that. When they pay for our services, they want they want sustainability to be an assumed part of that.
All right. Increasingly a price of entry in terms of non-competitive. So, yeah, makes sense. Let me shift. I'm actually going to jump a couple of questions because I want to bring Andrea back in and ask her a question about, some trends we're seeing in generational interest and intent to spend when it comes to travel. So we've got, we've forever we've been talking about, as many have, the the millennial traveler, now the Gen Z traveler, and it's an ingrained part of the DNA of these generations to travel and explore and get out, and we see that in everything that we look at. At the same time, when we're asking people about their travel intent and spending intention, it's clear boomers have the discretionary income and the discretionary time and disposable income to be able to invest in travel at a level that far exceeds, what the younger generations are able to do. So how do you balance those two, knowing that, many brands are really seeking the ear and the eyeballs of the younger generations? At the same time, we know some of the best travelers out there who have the most money to spend are the boomer generation.
Yeah, I think for that, it's important to think about the different travel behaviors and motivators that come from each of those generations, and just really, not take a one size fits all approach in terms of who comes to the destination. So I think what we see in the portrait data is kind of a difference in terms of how those two areas travel. So with boomers, you have, like you mentioned, they're willing to spend more on their trips and also travel more frequently. Their top motivators a lot of the time are spending time with significant others or families. And we see that generation being really loyal, especially to hotel brands. So that traveler is going to be, more likely to look for travel accommodations that are going to fall within your core hotel loyalty brands. And on the flip side, we see a little bit different for Gen Z. They're traveling less frequently than the boomer generation. But one thing that they're really concerned about is making their money go farther. So they're really value-based traveler in terms of, their loyalty comes from wanting discounts or unlocking special um, I guess, experiences. So we see them being a little bit more loyal in that way as a way to get more value and make their money go farther. So even though they are spending less, they're very keyed into like how to make that the most of that. And then their top motivators are more about self-discovery and trying new cuisines. So very different than, the boomer who wants to spend time and unplug and be with their family. And then one other thing we see in terms of accommodations is that Gen Z is more likely to book that short-term vacation rental as opposed to a hotel accommodation. So um, a lot of that is based on the value, like we just discussed. So Gen Z is willing to sacrifice some of those things that come from a loyal hotel brand, like housekeeping and free breakfast, in exchange for a lower nightly rate and staying at a vacation rental where they can save some money and um, you know cook at the hotel or the short-term vacation rental if they want to. So I think just taking a different approach between each of the different generations and really speaking to, what would motivate them to come to the destination and how we can adjust the approach is what I would recommend.
Yeah, no, it's funny. We've looked at this for a long time in terms of the number of destinations, for example, that the respondents in surveys tell us that they have an interest in visiting over the next 2 years. And inevitably, as you get older, that number starts to shrink. And you might say, well, that seems counterintuitive if you expect people to have more experiences and then their appetite and their budget available to travel grows. You think maybe they're thinking about more destinations. But I think it's just the opposite in many respects. You dream big when you're younger. There's all these places you haven't been and you want to see and you want to go. But as you get older, you start to, prioritize certain things, maybe a more predictable travel experience, maybe a safer travel experience, whatever it might be. But over time, your priorities change and your thinking, may ultimately change as a result of that. So I think that predictability plays into it. I think, the loyalty, elevation and loyalty looks like it's, as much about you've had a lifetime to build a relationship with a brand, right? You have points. You have a big a bucket of points that makes it, and you want to continue to grow that. So, I think that's plays into it as well. Um, Simon, we talked a little bit about a minute ago, the price of entry and sustainability potentially being kind of a price of entry, consideration in time. What are some things that you believe, maybe is that one presumably, and would there be other things that you're seeing that people are willing to pay for now, but they increasingly they're likely to push back on in the future. They expect them to be rolled, and they expect travel service providers to offer. What are some things you're looking at?
Yeah, I think obviously we don't want to talk about sustainability for the whole session, but yeah, that is a big one. I think we would see pushback from people that's like, of course, the brands, the services that I'm paying money for should be integrating a sustainable behavior into what they're selling to me, whether that's a travel package, whether it's accommodation or flights. The idea that you should have to pay more to almost have an exclusive right to be behaving in a way that doesn't damage the wider world seems like a very weird way of living in today's world. And I think more and more people will become more and more vocal about that and push back on those things. I think more broadly, we're seeing people kind of starting to think about, the people are spending more. They do, as Trey said, they want to spend more because they want to spend more. But at the same time, people will be spending what they can within their budgets. So the things that people are looking into when they're putting together a budget for their trip, or they're paying deposits, or they're paying for certain things, they'll be examining all of the different things that come into that fall into that. And I think Andreas used the phrase a free breakfast, and it's like, if that's the kind of thing, those small things that when you're booking a hotel, you'll be like, well, yeah, I'm booking a 5-star experience or a 4-star experience. I'm spending hundreds of dollars on this. Why shouldn't breakfast be included? Why should I be paying like this tiered approach when everyone is effectively in the same place, having the same experience with, for the effectively the same reason? We want to go and unplug. We want to spend time with our families. We want to sit by a swimming pool or explore the local nature. But we're all kind of in the same area, so there shouldn't be that kind of tiered exclusivity approach for what is effectively a one size fits all solution. Um, and I think people will be just more in general, they're more demanding of flexibility. So people want to be able to customize their own holidays. They want to be able to kind of fit more things in at their own pace when they're traveling. To kind of pay an extortionate amount to be able to do that, I think people will push back and sort of look at how they can do it themselves. And they'll push back on the organized tour from the hotel for X $100. I actually just think, well, we can probably go and speak to some locals, or we can get a cab, we can walk there. So pushing back on what previously has been kind of touted as exclusive or part of the package, but it actually, there's incremental costs at every stage. People will start being a bit more conscious of that and thinking this incremental cost, that doesn't give us any value. It's not valuable to us. It's just we're paying for something that we can achieve ourselves in a way that's maybe even more fun and more memorable, which is one of the key reasons why people are taking trips in the first place, is to make those memories, not to spend that money.
Yeah. Yeah, for what it's worth, I'm a big believer that spa services and massages and whatnot should also be included for all guests at a hotel, but not sure that's coming anytime soon. Trey, in continuing, as we think about some of the barriers to travel, some of the hurdles, you've got, with the isolated military conflicts or wars that are happening, in various parts of the world, and certainly we're seeing that grow, and their magnitude, their importance in terms of the duration and the consideration on travel that creates. What is it that what type of impact do you see in the immediate term? I think is probably fairly obvious, but how do you see that impact having a longer term play in the minds of travelers? What do you expect could change, and how might that influence what we do from a planning perspective and a travel industry planning perspective overall?
Yeah, I literally just saw a headline maybe an hour ago talking about airlines increasing their fares to offset some of the jet fuel costs that have already increased for them. Jet fuel, I think it's like 20 to 30% of airline overhead. So we're definitely going to see those travel costs increase in the short term. I think long term, I think there's going to be some sort of social impacts that could definitely impact international travel specifically. I think this is one of the first editions of the Portrait of an American Traveler where we saw safety really rise as a deterrent to travel, more so for international travel than domestic travel. I think a lot of Americans are concerned that either they're going to travel somewhere and have a bunch of delays and get stuck, or they're going to travel somewhere and the perceptions of people are going to be negative in the place that they go. I saw another headline recently that said somewhere around 40% of Americans have lied about being American while traveling internationally. And I think, we I don't know how they're getting away with that. I think it becomes pretty obvious based on accent alone, but I think that is something that we might see rise where, Americans become concerned about the perceptions of themselves for political reasons, for any number of reasons, the way that people are going to perceive them internationally, and that might be a deterrent to, leaving the United States. That said, I think from a DMO perspective, there is a story to be told there that can benefit from people wanting to stick a little bit closer to home. Focusing on drive markets, really ramping up media right in their immediate area. Telling a very sort of safety Americana sort of storyline that is going to resonate with where travelers are mentally right now. So I see that being sort of the long-term impact, but in the short term, I think costs and just perceptions of safety are going to be hitting us pretty hard.
Well, you talked about the being able to identify Americans and lying, I think 40% lying about being American. I think the easiest way to do that, if I remember correctly, is if you see somebody wearing sandals at St. Peter's Basilica, they're probably
That sounds right.
so, the let me just pause there. Great discussion to this point, everyone. Let me pause there and ask Megan if there are any questions that have come in, or if anyone has anything to put into chat. We want to make sure we're reacting to what all of you are thinking out there who are watching this as well. So, any questions that we could maybe tackle to the team or share?
We died, not at the moment, but we encourage them. We had a question about, will this be available? Because they're enjoying your presentation. But that's
Okay,
it so
great.
far.
Well, we'll keep moving then. I just want to make sure we didn't get to the end and not have any time for questions. So encourage you to add questions, as Megan said, and we'll try to tackle those before the end of the session to the extent possible. So one thing I'm going to throw out to the group here and let you react to it. So we're thinking about not only what's happening obviously in 2026, but what we expect to come in 2027, 2028, and got to be thinking ahead because not that our planning necessarily extends further out, it actually extends probably closer in these days, and we adapt more frequently than we once did. But the question comes up frequently in terms of what are you thinking about for 2027, especially what are the trends out there, whether that's AR and VR and wearables? Is it the rising unpredictability of geopolitical travel? What are the things out there that really are kind of sitting in the back of your head, like this is going to be a big deal, and it's going to be a bigger deal even next year?
I'll jump in there. I think for me, more of a socioeconomic trend that I'm watching is those generational shifts. There is going to be an incredible transfer of wealth between now and 2030 as the baby boomer generation shrinks and Gen Z, Gen A comes of age and starts traveling more. I think that is going to have an incredible impact on the labor force. We're going to have an incredible number of baby boomers sort of leaving the labor force and younger generations not really being able to keep up with that. I think the tourism industry specifically is going to struggle with that. We're already having labor shortages. So that is something that gives me a little bit of pause and concern in the coming years. That said, I think from a brand perspective, especially from a destination perspective, there is a people story to be told there that is going to offset some of that. I think, as the labor force shrinks and skilled labor becomes harder to come by, the people are going to become even more important. So telling the story of small businesses in a destination, or just really focusing on the people that make people's destination, or people's vacations in a destination really shine, is going to become more important, especially as we're seeing travelers be motivated more by passions and hobbies. They want to know that when they go to a place, those passions and hobbies are supported by people who really care about those same things. So that people story, I think, is going to become even more important, and that's definitely something I'll be sort of talking about more and more with clients as the years go by.
Next, Simon or Andrea, anything you'd like to offer?
Sure.
Ladies first.
Yeah. I think something else that's interesting, just talking about the economic pressures and the increased costs of everything. Something we're thinking about a lot is like how the luxury travelers evolved, in terms of like how do you approach rising costs in a destination and it reaching what was previously considered more of a luxury price point, but not necessarily being a luxury experience. So, thinking about how to promote that to travelers, and especially getting back to the value conversation of like, how do you tie that into what the new luxury looks like, or making sure that there is that value exchange in terms of what they're paying more for.
Yeah, that's to me, that's probably the biggest thing that I look at in this, and you kind of we're talking the exact same thing. I had made a note on this as well, is that getting back to that question of bifurcation of income, you've got what is we're constantly being asked about luxury travelers now, and increasingly that luxury traveler destination or definition is more the norm than it is some exclusive tier that we're just gonna, try to attract that segment. It's more the focus of, for destinations increasingly because prices have increased and you've got a smaller percentage of the population, that concentration of wealth, smaller percentage able to afford the types of experiences that the destination really wants to talk about and can deliver at a high level. So, and certainly, and that's different in different destinations, but we're seeing a lot more of that. So interestingly, or I think that'll be really interesting, how do we handle that from a destination experience design perspective, and then ultimately from a communications perspective. Love the thought. So, Simon, I didn't mean to jump in front of you there, but my point was related directly to Andrea's point. So,
Yeah, of course. I think just to add to that, I think when we're thinking about the future and kind of what trends are important, often we'll think about things like technology, new technologies. You mentioned AR and VR as potential trends, but I think what's important is to always see how those advances, those innovations form part of a bigger picture trends. Something like AR or VR, I don't think it's going to motivate someone to travel, but it's part of that bigger picture towards experiences or convenience, or being able to access something from a mobility point of view that previously they wouldn't have access to, and opening up the world of travel. So these things are kind of stepping stones to the end result, which, going back to Trey's point, I think is the big thing is going to be about that self-identity, that passion-led desire for experiences. And it will be impacted by other things that will kind of come and go along the way over the next few years. Things like AI. I think we don't yet know how AI will play out because there's so many things to come in terms of legislation, opening it up to more people or closing it off to more people, depending on whether OpenAI suddenly decides to start charging for ChatGPT or for whatever tools are available. If we start seeing more and more people turning away from what we call traditional social media now, the likes of Facebook and Instagram, and moving towards different things, that will have an impact on how people are motivated to choose destinations because of the media they're consuming. So I think it's more about lots more people taking a step back from kind of always looking at what other people are doing and thinking, what is this giving me, myself? Like going to a vacation destination because they want to go to that destination, not because they've seen nice pictures or someone has told them or ChatGPT has given them an option. It's because it brings something out in themselves that maybe they've lost over the past few years of uncertainty, going back to, COVID or even the recession before that. And just this idea of identity and empowerment, and people, wanting to ground themselves in something more real, and what better way to do that than, literally putting your feet in a different country or a different destination, and kind of remembering what makes you yourself. And I think that's going to be a really important driver for many, many people going forward.
Love it. Well, I think we've got time maybe for one more question. I don't see anything in the chat. If I'm missing something, Megan, jump in and tell me. But let's see, I have one more question. I'm going to go to you, Trey, on this one. And it gets back to something Simon talked about in terms of the traditional hotels and resorts compared to short-term rentals. And we've seen rising interest and popularity of short-term rentals, obviously for a number of years right now. But what are these? How do you see all that playing out? Because short-term rentals have there's an appeal to those. I'm sure you'll tell us what that is, but there's a number of reasons that people tell us why those are a really appealing option.
Yeah.
And it changes by age, it changes by income, it changes by the experience people want to have. But what do you see? How do you see all that playing out in the trends going forward here?
Yeah. This one is a hard one to keep track of because I feel like it changes on like a quarterly basis, whether people prefer a short-term rental or a hotel. I think, last year and the year before, as we saw more people traveling with larger groups, everyone was sort of reconnecting post-COVID. Um, multi-generational travel has continued to sort of increase over the past couple of years. People needed more space. So short-term rentals seemed like the thing to do. But I think hotels quickly responded to that and started to, create more opportunities to give people the space that they need to travel with grandma, grandpa, aunts, and uncles. So, that advantage quickly sort of eroded. And then as we started to see people travel a little bit more intently, think about their passions and their hobbies sort of as the driver for what's taking them to a destination. The hotel itself became a part of the overall experience. That's why we're seeing in our reports people starting to say that they choose a boutique hotel first, or a bed and breakfast is especially popular among those Gen Z consumers. They want the place that they stay to not just be a place that they go to rest. They very much want it to be a part of the experience. So, local antiques or having a little bit of history in the building that you stay in is becoming increasingly important to people, and you don't necessarily get that from a short-term rental. You can have some unique opportunities through Airbnb experiences and things like that, but for the most part, hotels have really responded and are starting to tell their stories rather than just their amenities, because they've realized that has become very important to consumers. So I think we'll continue to see that battle sort of play out. But right now, I feel like hotels kind of have the edge.
Well, it's one thing that I found pretty fascinating about the research is it shows that people who are those who say that they're increasingly interested in short-term rentals are, we ask them why. And some of that, the answers relate very specifically to food and culinary experiences and that local culture that they can, find and kind of embed in the community versus being in the traditional tourism corridors. And so I think that that's an important part of, this, in terms of preferences of travelers and what they want to experience. Yeah, shameless plug. I saw that Matthew Stone and Tracy Ann Logan are both, at least had signed up to join this webinar, and we'll be digging into that topic very specifically at the international conference in Greenville in a couple of months, really understanding how culinary trends impact travel and tourism and what we're seeing, some of the changing or evolving insights there that are kind of guiding our decision making. So be sure to join us for that in Greenville. And I'm going to pass it. I want to thank all of our panelists, obviously, and really appreciate your insights and smarts. And I'm going to pass it back over to Megan to close us out.